This is the last video for the semester, and it concerns the final required reading assignment we had, which was called The Cave, and it's written by a philosopher named Plato. One of the first things I want to go over is that this short piece called The Cave is sometimes called the allegory of the cave. And an allegory is in which one thing represents one other thing. When we talk about analogies are when we compare one thing to something else to help us understand what it is we're talking about. Many of you are probably familiar with Jesus and his parables. The word parable means to cast alongside. It was usually we'd put this thing here and then we'd set this other thing beside it so that the audience could better understand an idea that Jesus was teaching about, ultimately in a way of illuminating for the audience what the kingdom of heaven was going to be like. That was usually why the parables were used. And in this text, if you've read it already, you'll see at the end that the speaker says, here's what the cave represents, here's what the light represents. And when a writer makes it very clear that this object or this action means this specific thing, usually we're in the realm of allegory. When you talk about symbols, you talk about an object, a physical thing having a metaphysical meaning. Sometimes we can get in trouble there because we can say, well, this object means, this is how I feel that it means, or this is what I think that it means. And in those cases, we have to pay very close attention to the text to see what the text reveals that the object might mean. So a really good example here is the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The ring is a symbol of power. It makes that very clear in the text without coming out and necessarily saying, hey everyone, the ring represents power. But the evidence is there in the story, in what other characters say. There's another example of this in the Chronicles of Narnia series, the character Aslan, the great lion. The text makes it clear without coming out and saying it who it is Aslan represents. And in writings outside of those books by C.S. Lewis, the author, Lewis will tell people this is who Aslan is supposed to represent. Well, over a decade ago now, when the books were being turned into films, and Liam Neeson was the voice of Aslan, he did a great job, by the way. There was an interview that Liam Neeson gave in which he said, Aslan means this. And it was the exact opposite of what the actual text makes clear and what the author had made clear in some other writings. But that'd be an example of symbolism, and we have to pay very close attention there. But anyways, back to this piece called The Cave. It's on the printout that you were given. It says that it's from book 7 of the Republic, and this is my copy of the Republic. This is an ancient text, an ancient Greek text written by a philosopher named Plato. But the person in the piece that you have, and the person in the entire book who does the talking, is Socrates. It's believed that Socrates was the teacher of Plato, and then later Plato was a teacher of someone named Aristotle. And then Aristotle would teach several other well-known figures from history, one of them being Alexander the Great. Anyways, the reason I wanted to let you know that The Cave is a shorter work within a longer work called The Republic is because the book The Republic deals with one question. And the question is, what is justice? How do you define it? How do you describe it? What will it look like? The idea of justice is giving to people that which they deserve, whether that be reward, whether that be punishment. So by the time we get to book 7 of the Republic, we're towards the end now, we have this piece called The Cave. And in that, Socrates says in the opening line, let me show in a figure or a picture how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. So we know right from the very beginning Socrates is going to give us an illustration of what it means to be enlightened or unenlightened. The rhetorical pattern of illustration has within it the root word illuminate, which means to shine a light on, to make clear. And if you think of an illustrative text like a comic book, the idea there is we have the dialogue, we have the action lines, but you also have these pictures that are supposed to help us better see what is happening. And ideally, even without pictures, your writing can be clear enough so that a reader can see what it is you're trying to say. And I think everything you've been required to read this semester are good examples of writers who are able to make clear, make visible the arguments that they're trying to make. So Socrates comes out and he says, look, I'm going to give you a picture of what it means to be unenlightened and enlightened. And the picture that he gives us is these prisoners who've been there since childhood. They're chained in their neck, they're chained at their feet, they can't move. They can only look ahead at the wall of the cave in front of them. And behind them is a fire. And the fire is separated from those prisoners by a short wall. And behind that wall are these people holding up puppets or objects in front of the fire. And the light of the fire is casting the shadows of those puppets or objects on the walls, and that's what the prisoners are looking at. And you can Google images of this, and if we were in a class, we'd draw this up on the board. But Socrates is giving us an image today of what we would call the movie theater. In the movie theater, you sit in a chair, you have more mobility, but the idea is that you're looking one direction, and behind us is the camera, or the projector, and it's casting its light overhead onto the screen, and it's giving us a moving picture. That's what movies were originally called. So then Socrates says, here's the picture of what it means to be unenlightened. You're imprisoned, you're looking at shadows on the wall, and he will give us a definition of what it means to be unenlightened. And the definition is on page 2 of your handout, and he says, look again and see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of their error. What is the error? It's just a few lines above that. He says, to them, the prisoners, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images. So in other words, the unenlightened person thinks that shadows are the total of reality. The shadows are real, but in order to have a shadow, you must have an object from which that shadow is coming from. And the unenlightened person, according to Socrates, doesn't understand that, doesn't comprehend that. And notice here earlier in the text, Socrates, when he's laying out this picture, and the person he's talking to says, you've given me a strange image, and these are strange prisoners. Socrates says, yes, this is what we all go through. So Socrates is even saying that there was a point in his life in which he was unenlightened. But then we get after that definition, back to page 2, he says, now watch what happens if the unenlightened are disabused of their error, if they are shown that, hey, the shadows are not all there are of reality. So we have this picture, and now we have a cause that's going to have an effect. And one of the things you see in this text, if you go back and track it, you'll see that we have the rhetorical pattern of illustration, which requires description. He also offers us a definition of what it means to be unenlightened. There will later be a definition of what it means to be enlightened. Now he introduces cause and effect. Cause and effect will naturally lead to a narrative pattern, a story pattern, because all stories are built on cause and effect. And there's also the implication of process. This step, then this step, then this step. In other words, there are a lot of rhetorical patterns being used in this piece. So Socrates says, imagine that the chains are taken off the prisoners, and there's an instructor down there who turns the prisoners and shows them, look at this fire that's in here. Look at the puppeteers holding these objects. Look at the shadows that are on the wall. The shadows are not all there is of reality. There is more. And then Socrates says, what do you think is going to happen? One thing that might happen is there will definitely be some pain involved. And I think when we come to a deeper understanding of something, there is always some type of pain that's involved. Usually, even if it's just that pain of, I don't know what it is that's happening, I'm going through a time of uncertainty, I'm grasping what's happening, and I'm trying some, and I'm failing some. That can be a painful experience. And if we were in a face-to-face class right now, you can experience this when you ask a student a question. Will you speak in front of your peers? Will you get up and stand up in front of your peers? Will you take a risk at getting something wrong? And then Socrates says two other things might happen. Those who realize that the shadows are not all there was of reality, they might return back to their position and remain with the shadows. That's what's comfortable, and that is what's known. But if someone else is, with the instructor, dragged up out of the cave towards the light, towards the sun outside of the cave, there will be more pain that that person will experience, but over time and through a process, eventually the person becomes enlightened. And here's the definition that Socrates provides of the enlightened person. He will be able to see the sun, and not mere reflections of the sun in the water, but he will also see the sun in his own proper place and not in another, and he will contemplate the sun as he is. In other words, Socrates is saying that the enlightened person is able to see the shadow and the thing causing the shadow. He's able to see things in their proper place. So we can see the sun reflected in water, but that's not where the sun is. The sun is outside of our earth. But the enlightened person not only sees things in their proper place, he will also go on and understand the connection that everything has. So while the sun has its place in the cosmos, it still has an effect on this earth and on its humans. Just as water ought to have its place, but it also has an effect on the things around it. Trees have their proper place. The human being has its proper place. Animals have their proper place. There's an order to the world. And the enlightened person is able to see that and then contemplate it and meditate on it. I don't know that I've said it in these videos. I often say it in my in-person classes. What we work on in a composition class is not disconnected from reality. Things that we talk about in this class are affected by life outside of the classroom, and they should turn and have an influence on life outside of the classroom. Because ultimately, a composition class, and the way it's been set up, is driving you to think. It's driving you to think about how to communicate, especially with the written word. But oftentimes to do that, you have to be able to talk. You have to be able to take time to sit still, to be quiet, to read, to think about what other people are saying, to listen, and then to try to put those words onto a page, and there will be failure along the way. This is what it means to be an enlightened person. But that's not the end of the piece. Socrates will go on to say that even though enlightenment is a process, it's a process that involves the body, it's a process that involves the mind, it's a process that involves an instructor. It is something not in which we become prideful in our knowledge, we become very humble in the realization of how grand everything is, how interconnected, how complex everything is. I had a professor in college who would say, with everything we learn just how much there is to learn. Or he'd say it another way, with everything I know, I become more aware of just how much I don't know. Well, Socrates says once the person is enlightened, are they going to stay up there in the natural world, outside the cave for the rest of their life? Or will they start to remember what it was like to be in the cave and be thankful that they are no longer there, but also feel pity for those who still are? And do you think, Socrates says, that the enlightened should then go back down into the cave to try to help someone else? And the person that Socrates is speaking with, his name is Glaucon. Glaucon says, yes, that's what they should do. And then Socrates says, well, what do you think is going to happen if they try to do that? Well, they will return into the land of darkness, and their eyes will need time to adjust back into that world. And they will probably bump into people who don't want them down there. And the worst case scenario is the people in the cave might kill the one who is enlightened. I think we have examples of this. Again, I referred to Jesus at the beginning of the lecture with his teaching in parables. This is also an example of Christ, the great illuminated one who would come to earth, and in his teaching and in his illuminating and drawing people towards enlightenment, there were plenty of those who called and had him put to death. Comparably, Plato, who's writing the Republic, he uses Socrates as his main character. It is said that Socrates was put to death as well for teaching in a way that allowed people to see the complexities of reality. And you can look up, I think it's called the Trial of Socrates. It's a short piece in which the court system of Athens at that time would find him guilty, and they would give Socrates two options. Either we will let you live if you accept our exile of you from Athens and you never return to Athens. You are banished from here forever. Or you can choose to stay, and if you choose to stay, you will be executed. And Socrates will choose to stay, and he will choose to drink a drink that will result in his own death. But he was put in a situation like that because he was someone who was trying to bring truth to the people. Socrates gets to the end of this text, and he talks now about the enlightened person. And when you get to the very end of the piece, he tells Glaucon, he says, if this is what it means to be enlightened, because Socrates says, I could be wrong, but if this is what it means to be enlightened, then that means that some of the educators who are talking about the human being being what's called a blank slate, you might hear the term tabula rasa, that then instructors and teachers can just put whatever they want onto them and control how a person develops. Socrates says, if my illustration of enlightenment is true, then it means that that idea of the human being as a blank slate is false. So we have this huge argument for what it means to be a human being, what it means to become enlightened, and that should have consequences on how we try to teach and how we try to instruct. But it also puts responsibility into the hands of the learner. What kind of a responsibility will you take for your own education, for your own development? So I love reading this piece at the end of the semester. One, it's pretty challenging, but then we can take it, now that you're writing this final paper on what is love, you have an excellent example of someone who says, well, let me talk about what justice is, and let me give you a picture of what it looks like. Let me basically tell you a little story of what that looks like. Let me provide definitions of what my main terms mean. And then if my claim is true, what does it mean for this other thing that's happening? And your final paper needs to do that, right? When you provide for us an argument of what love is, you are naturally going to have to argue against what love is not. You're probably going to do well to pick, here's what someone has said that love is, or here's a popular idea of what love is, and you're going to have to grapple against that. And if your claim is true, if your definition of love, if your illustration of love, if your explanation and description of love is true, then what does that mean for the reader? What does that mean for your audience? And I think of the text you've been given this semester, there's at least one text that provides a picture of what love is. You can go back and read those winter Sundays. The writer there gives us a short scene, a short story, highly descriptive, highly imagistic, of love's lonely and austere offices. So again, you're writing your final paper. Some of you probably have a draft ready. It's due in a couple of days. I would encourage you to, after you watch this video, go back and glance at the texts that you've been required to read this semester. Make sure that you have made clear what your thesis is. Make sure you've defined the terms that you need to define. If there's an illustration that you can provide, and I'm not saying go grab an image and paste it into your paper. I'm talking about with your own words. Is there an illustration that you can use to help readers see what it is you're saying? I thank you for the semester that we've had together. If you've made it this far, you've done a good job staying in there and enduring the course. I look forward to reading your final papers, and perhaps we'll see each other again in 102. Thank you.